Ever boarded a flight thinking it was just another routine trip, only to realize you've stepped right into the middle of a dangerous game? What if the flight attendants weren't just serving drinks, but orchestrating something far darker? What if the luxury airline you trusted was actually a front for a criminal empire? Tonight, a top civil rights attorney takes a first-class seat on a flight she was never meant to survive. Lies, power, and corruption unfold at 35,000 feet. Will she land safely, or has she uncovered a secret too dangerous to escape? Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The morning air in New York carried a crisp bite, cutting through the constant hum of the city's movement. Naomi Ellsworth pulled the lapels of her coat tighter as she stepped onto the sidewalk, the scent of roasted coffee drifting from a nearby cart. The Brooklyn skyline stretched behind her, a reminder of the city she had fought so hard to make her home. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself before heading into the building. Today would be another battle, one she had grown accustomed to in her years as a civil rights attorney. Inside her firm's modest yet well-kept office, the phone lines buzzed and the low murmur of voices filled the space. Naomi set her briefcase on the desk, flipping it open to reveal neatly arranged case files. She had spent years taking on cases others shied away from: police misconduct, housing discrimination, employment injustices. But the one that landed on her desk last night felt different. Sky Nova Airlines. A lawsuit had been filed against the major airline for racial discrimination against black passengers. Naomi had seen her fair share of corporations mistreating people of color, but this one came with a disturbing pattern. Multiple complaints, all eerily similar. A subtle but deliberate exclusion of black travelers from premium class seating. The reports were full of coded language: seat reassignment due to system errors, safety concerns, miscommunication. All nonsense. Naomi had seen these tactics before. Ethan Park, her longtime colleague and one of the few people she trusted in this field, leaned against her doorway, arms crossed. "You're really going for this, huh?" His tone carried the weight of someone who had spent years watching her take on the impossible. She didn't look up from the file. "It's not a choice. They've been doing this for too long." Ethan exhaled, stepping further in. "I checked into Sky Nova's legal team. They don't play around. They have deep pockets and ties in high places. They'll bury this case before it ever sees a courtroom." Naomi finally met his gaze. "Then we dig them up before they get the chance." Ethan shook his head with a mix of admiration and concern. "Just watch your back. People with that much money don't like being told they're wrong." She knew he was right, but she also knew that backing down had never been an option for her. As if to emphasize his point, her phone screen lit up with a new email. No subject line, no sender name, just one sentence staring back at her. "Be careful who you pick fights with. Sky Nova isn't your problem to solve." She stared at the message, feeling a slow, creeping chill work its way up her spine. She had been threatened before, but something about this felt different. She tapped her fingers against the desk, thinking. Then she reached for her phone and booked a ticket. If she wanted the truth, she would have to see it firsthand. A direct flight from Los Angeles to New York, first class, Sky Nova Airlines. It was time to meet the enemy face to face. The airport buzzed with its usual controlled chaos. Business travelers rushing to their gates, families herding restless children, the occasional lost tourist glancing at departure boards with confusion. Naomi moved through the crowd with purpose, her carry-on rolling smoothly behind her. She had done this 100 times before, but today felt different. This wasn't just another flight. This was a battlefield. She reached the Sky Nova Airlines first-class check-in counter, handing over her boarding pass. The young attendant, a polished woman in her mid-20s, barely glanced at her before typing something into the computer. A pause, a shift in body language, then the tight-lipped, professional smile. "Miss Ellsworth, it looks like there's been a reassignment. We'll need to move you to a different seat." Naomi tilted her head. "Excuse me?" The woman maintained her composed expression. "There was a last-minute change in our seating arrangement. We have a great seat for you in our premium economy section." Naomi let the silence stretch between them. I see. And what was wrong with my original seat? The attendant's fingers tapped against the keyboard. I apologize for the inconvenience. It's just a technical reassignment. A rehearsed lie. Naomi had seen it too many times. She inhaled sharply through her nose, fighting the temptation to make a scene right here, right now. Instead, she held the woman's gaze. I'll be keeping my seat. The attendant hesitated, but then gave a short nod, forcing another smile. Of course, Miss Ellsworth. Enjoy your flight. Naomi took her boarding pass and walked toward security, one hurdle down. Boarding was already underway by the time she reached the gate. As she stepped onto the aircraft, the polished interior of Sky Nova's first-class cabin gleamed under soft ambient lighting. The scent of expensive leather and freshly brewed espresso filled the air. Naomi located her seat and stowed her bag, settling in just as the cabin doors were preparing to close. That's when she saw her, Sloane Whitaker. The woman stood at the front of the cabin, wearing the fitted Navy uniform of Sky Nova's lead flight attendants, her platinum blonde hair tucked into a sleek chignon. She carried herself with the effortless confidence of someone who had always been in control. Naomi had seen her type before. Sloane moved through the aisle with an air of studied grace, her sharp blue eyes flickering over each passenger. When they landed on Naomi, something shifted. A moment's hesitation, a flicker of something unreadable. Then the mask returned, the pleasant but hollow smile. "Welcome aboard Sky Nova Airlines," she said smoothly. "We hope you have a wonderful flight." Naomi didn't reply. She just watched. The safety demonstration played on the screens, and the plane began taxiing toward the runway. Everything seemed normal. Almost. But Naomi could feel it. The unspoken tension, the way Sloane's gaze kept returning to her, like she was a loose thread in a perfectly woven tapestry. Then, as the plane ascended into the night sky, Sloane made her way down the aisle, stopping at Naomi's seat. She leaned in slightly, just enough for only Naomi to hear. "You might want to stay in your lane, Miss Ellsworth." Naomi's lips barely moved. "And what lane would that be?" Sloane's smile didn't waver, but there was an unmistakable sharpness beneath it. "The one where you don't ask questions you don't want answers to." With that, she straightened, smoothing the fabric of her uniform, and disappeared into the galley. Naomi exhaled, turning her gaze toward the window. The city lights below grew smaller and smaller until they faded into darkness. Something was very wrong with this flight, and she had every intention of finding out what. The steady hum of the engines filled the cabin, blending with the occasional clink of glasses and the hushed conversations of first-class passengers. Naomi leaned back against the plush leather of her seat, eyes fixed on the reflection in her window. The city lights had long vanished beneath the dense clouds, leaving only the ink-black sky stretching infinitely ahead. She replayed Sloane's words in her mind. "Stay in your lane." It wasn't just a warning, it was a dare. A soft chime signaled the start of the meal service, and Naomi turned her gaze toward the aisle. Flight attendants moved efficiently between rows, delivering pre-plated gourmet dishes to each passenger. Sloane remained at the front of the cabin, speaking quietly with another crew member before disappearing through the curtain leading to the galley. Naomi's fingers traced the stem of her water glass absent-mindedly. Something about Sloane's presence unsettled her, but it wasn't just the obvious arrogance or privilege. It was the way she carried herself, like someone who wasn't just enforcing the rules of the airline, but the rules of something much bigger. A shadow passed in her peripheral vision. Naomi turned just in time to catch a glimpse of a man in a gray suit slipping into the lavatory near the front of the cabin. Nothing unusual, except he had been sitting in first class for the last 2 hours without so much as shifting in his seat. She narrowed her eyes. The man had boarded early, settling into his seat with an ease that suggested he had done this before. No eye contact with other passengers, no unnecessary movement. Even his posture was too composed. Her instincts twitched. A minute passed, then 2, then 5. When he finally emerged, his steps were slower, more measured. He reached into his pocket and tapped a message on his phone before tucking it away and returning to his seat. Naomi glanced toward the lavatory. Something told her that wasn't a routine bathroom visit. She shifted slightly, catching the attention of a passing flight attendant. A younger man with dark hair and sharp brown eyes, his name tag read Jordan Mendez. He seemed newer, a little more cautious than the others. Naomi smiled politely. "Excuse me, is there a reason someone would spend over 5 minutes in a first-class lavatory?" Jordan hesitated, glancing toward the man in the gray suit before lowering his voice. "Passengers take their time sometimes. It's not uncommon." Naomi tilted her head. "And do they usually tap messages on their phone as soon as they walk out?" Jordan's jaw tensed slightly. "Ma'am, is there something specific I can assist you with?" Naomi studied his face. He was being careful. Too careful. She decided to push a little harder. "I'm a lawyer. I see things that don't add up, and I can tell when someone's uncomfortable." Jordan inhaled slowly. For a split second, Naomi thought he might walk away. But then, almost imperceptibly, he shifted his stance. His shoulders dropped just slightly, the tension in his face easing just enough to confirm what she suspected. "I can't talk here," he murmured, "but you should be careful about the questions you ask." And just like that, he turned on his heel and moved down the aisle, resuming his duties. Naomi's pulse quickened. First Sloane, now Jordan, and a man in a gray suit who wasn't just an ordinary passenger. Something was happening on this flight, and Naomi had just stepped right into it. The soft clatter of silverware and muffled conversations filled the first-class cabin, masking the tension that now coiled in Naomi's chest. The exchange with Jordan lingered in her mind. His warning had been subtle, but unmistakable. Whatever was happening on this flight, he was either too afraid to speak about it or too involved to risk exposing himself. Naomi sipped her water, glancing casually around the cabin. The man in the gray suit had settled back into his seat, his expression unreadable. He didn't look nervous. He didn't fidget. He simply waited. For what? Sloane reappeared, her polished composure unchanged. She moved gracefully down the aisle, stopping near the man's seat. Naomi didn't miss the way she subtly angled her body toward him, shielding the brief conversation from the view of the other passengers. Sloane reached down, adjusting a tray on the man's table as she spoke. It was a minor movement, something a passenger might not even notice. But Naomi did, because when Sloane straightened, something small had shifted hands. A transaction, quick, precise. Naomi's stomach tightened. The man slipped whatever he had received into his jacket pocket without so much as a glance downward. Sloane continued on as if nothing had happened, returning to her post at the front of the cabin. Naomi leaned back in her seat, feigning a casual air, but her mind was working fast. Was this what Jordan had been warning her about? An under-the-table deal happening at 35,000 feet? She reached for her phone, intending to make a note of the interaction, but as expected, no signal. The in-flight Wi-Fi remained conveniently unavailable. A tactic, perhaps? If something illegal was going on, blocking outside communication would be a smart move. She needed another angle. Rising from her seat, she made her way toward the galley under the pretense of stretching her legs. Jordan was there, stocking a beverage cart, his movements precise but rushed. He looked up the moment she approached, his jaw tightening. "You shouldn't be back here, ma'am," he said, his voice low. Naomi leaned against the counter. "That man in 3A, he just received something from Sloane. You saw it, didn't you?" Jordan's hands stilled. A flicker of conflict crossed his features before he exhaled, keeping his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't understand what you're walking into." Naomi's pulse quickened. "Then explain it to me." Jordan hesitated, but then his eyes darted past her, toward the aisle. He stiffened. Naomi turned, following his gaze. Sloane was watching, not overtly, not with suspicion, but with the practiced ease of someone who knew how to monitor a situation without making it obvious. Jordan swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the beverage cart. "Go back to your seat," he murmured, "and stop asking questions." The words were sharp, but beneath them, Naomi heard something else. Fear. She held his gaze a moment longer, then slowly turned and made her way back to her seat. Something illicit was happening on this flight. That much was clear, but the real question was, how deep did it go? And how dangerous would it be for her to find out? The first-class cabin hummed with the low murmur of conversation, the occasional clink of glassware, and the ever-present hum of the engines cutting through the night sky. Naomi settled back into her seat, her mind a restless storm. She had spent years dissecting lies, reading between the lines, unraveling deception in courtrooms where the stakes were high. But this was different. This wasn't some carefully managed legal battle. This was something unfolding in real time, and she had just made herself a part of it. Her eyes flicked toward Sloane, who stood near the galley, speaking quietly with another flight attendant. There was something about her, something Naomi couldn't shake. Confidence. Sure. But it wasn't the kind that came from customer service training or the satisfaction of executing a well-rehearsed routine. No, Sloane carried herself like someone who knew they were untouchable, like someone who wasn't just enforcing the rules, but making them. And then there was Jordan. He had tried to warn her, tried to get her to back off. But Naomi had seen the way his hands had gripped the cart, the way his voice had dropped into something more urgent than professional courtesy. He wasn't just following orders. He was afraid, which meant whatever was happening here, it was bigger than her. She glanced toward the man in the gray suit. He was still in his seat, posture straight, face unreadable. Whatever Sloane had handed him, he had tucked it away as if it were second nature, as if he had done this before. Her fingers tapped absently against her armrest. She needed more information. Naomi pulled out her phone, knowing full well she wouldn't be able to send a message, but she wanted to document everything anyway. She opened the camera, subtly angling it toward the aisle, capturing a few seconds of video. The moment she hit record, a voice interrupted her thoughts. "You really shouldn't be doing that." Naomi turned her head slowly. Sloane stood beside her seat, arms crossed, that ever-present smirk hovering at the edges of her lips. Naomi met her gaze evenly. "I didn't realize recording was against airline policy." Sloane tilted her head, the dim cabin lights casting sharp shadows across her face. "It's not, but nosiness tends to get people into trouble." Naomi didn't blink. "Is that a threat?" Sloane's smile widened slightly, but her voice remained smooth. "Just an observation." Naomi exhaled, slipping her phone back into her lap, but she didn't look away. "Funny, I was about to say the same thing about you." A flicker of something, annoyance, amusement, flashed across Sloane's face before she leaned down slightly, just enough for only Naomi to hear. "Whatever you think you're seeing here, Miss Ellsworth, let it go." Naomi held her ground. "And if I don't?" Sloane straightened, brushing invisible lint from her sleeve. "Then I suppose we'll find out just how turbulent this flight can get." With that, she turned and walked away, disappearing behind the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the aircraft. Naomi exhaled slowly, turning her gaze back toward the window. She had just been warned. Again. And yet, for the first time on this flight, she wasn't scared. She was ready. Naomi sat motionless, fingers resting lightly against the smooth leather of the armrest. The hum of the aircraft engines vibrated beneath her skin, but it was the words still hanging in the air that sent a different kind of tremor through her. "Then I suppose we'll find out just how turbulent this flight can get." A challenge, a warning, a thinly veiled threat. Sloane wasn't just a flight attendant drunk on power. She was part of something much larger. Naomi had spent years dealing with arrogant corporate executives who believed they were untouchable. But this was something different. This was calculated, controlled, and now she had their attention. She shifted her gaze, scanning the cabin without turning her head. The man in the gray suit was still seated, unmoving, his hands resting lightly on his lap. From the outside, he looked just like any other businessman, but Naomi knew better. The exchange with Sloane had been quick, but precise. This was not his first time making a transaction mid-flight. A subtle movement near the galley caught her eye. Jordan. He was pushing a half-empty beverage cart toward the front, but his steps were stiffer than before. His eyes darted toward Naomi, then quickly away. He was rattled. Naomi knew she had to get to him before his fear made him retreat completely. She stood, stretching as if nothing was out of the ordinary, and made her way toward the lavatory. As she passed the galley, she caught Jordan's sleeve gently. "We need to talk," she murmured. Jordan hesitated, his jaw tightening before he sighed and nodded toward the back of the cabin. "Give me a minute." Naomi continued past, stepping into the lavatory and locking the door behind her. She wasn't planning on staying long, just enough to make it seem believable. The small mirror reflected the tension in her own face, the sharpness in her eyes that she couldn't smooth away even if she tried. When she stepped back into the aisle, Jordan was waiting near the galley, pretending to restock napkins. "Make it quick," he muttered. Naomi didn't waste time. "That man in 3A, who is he?" Jordan kept his gaze on the napkins, his fingers tightening slightly. "I don't know his name, but you know why he's here." A muscle jumped in Jordan's jaw. "He's not alone," he said finally, "and neither is Sloan." Naomi's stomach coiled. "What are they moving?" Jordan hesitated again, then let out a slow breath. "It's not just drugs." The confirmation sent a ripple of adrenaline through her veins. "This flight isn't just a routine trip," Jordan continued, keeping his voice barely above a whisper. "It's a corridor. Certain people, certain products get moved between cities this way. No customs, no security checks, no record." Naomi's mind worked fast. If what he was saying was true, then this wasn't just about one corrupt flight attendant or one man in a gray suit. This was organized. This was a system. Jordan shifted uncomfortably. "You don't want to be part of this." Naomi leaned in slightly. "Then help me stop it." Jordan let out a bitter chuckle, shaking his head. "You don't get it, do you? There's no stopping this. There's just surviving it." Before Naomi could press further, a shadow fell over them. Sloan. She stood with a tray of drinks in hand, her head tilted slightly, an expression of casual amusement on her face. "Something wrong, Jordan?" Naomi felt him stiffen beside her. "No, ma'am." Sloane's gaze flicked to Naomi, her smirk widening. "Ms. Ellsworth, I do hope you're enjoying your flight. Though I have to say, for a first-class passenger, you seem to spend a lot of time wandering around." Naomi forced a polite smile. "I like to stretch my legs." Sloane gave a slow nod, as if considering something. Then she handed Jordan the tray and turned back to Naomi. "Well, do let us know if you need anything." Her voice was light, but Naomi heard the weight behind the words. A warning. She held Sloane's gaze for a beat longer than necessary, then stepped around her, walking back toward her seat. As she settled back in, she glanced out the window. The plane was cruising smoothly, a blanket of black stretching endlessly beneath them. Sloane wasn't done with her yet. That much was clear. And Naomi? She had just decided she wasn't done with Sloane either. The flight continued its smooth trajectory through the night sky. But inside Naomi's mind, turbulence brewed. The pieces were coming together, revealing something far more sinister than she had initially suspected. This wasn't just about power-hungry airline staff mistreating passengers. This was organized crime, operating at 35,000 feet. She tapped her fingers on the armrest, her thoughts racing. If Jordan was right, Sky Nova Airlines was running a smuggling operation directly through their commercial flights. Drugs? Maybe. Weapons? Possibly. But the way he had hesitated, the look in his eyes when he said, "It's not just drugs," that told her there was more. Something worse. She needed proof. Her phone remained useless without Wi-Fi, and every attempt to connect was met with the same automated error message. Convenient. They had shut down communication on this flight for a reason. Naomi exhaled slowly, looking around the cabin. The man in 3A, her main suspect, had barely moved since the flight began. He sipped his drink methodically, eyes flicking to his phone every so often, though he never typed anything. A man waiting for a signal. And then there was Sloane, hovering just out of sight near the galley, her polished presence masking something far more dangerous. Naomi needed to act before they did. She leaned forward slightly, pressing the call button above her seat. Within seconds, Jordan appeared. His posture was rigid, his eyes darting toward the galley before he crouched beside her seat, keeping his voice low. "You shouldn't keep calling attention to yourself." Naomi kept her tone calm. "I need access to the cargo hold." Jordan's entire body went still. "Are you insane?" She held his gaze. "No, but I'm not blind either. You told me what's happening here. I need to see it for myself." Jordan ran a hand down his face, exhaling sharply. "Even if I wanted to help you, I don't have clearance to get down there. Naomi arched a brow. But someone does. Jordan swallowed hard, eyes flicking toward the cockpit door before shaking his head. You're playing with fire, lady. You have no idea how deep this goes. Naomi leaned in, her voice steady. Then tell me. Jordan hesitated, a war waging in his expression. Then finally he sighed. There's an access panel in the rear galley. It leads down to a storage area, small but big enough to hide things. If something is being moved, it'll be there. Naomi nodded. Can you get me down there? Jordan rubbed a hand over his jaw, looking genuinely torn. If they catch us, they won't? He let out a humorless chuckle. You're really willing to risk your life for this? Naomi's expression hardened. I don't play games when it comes to justice. Jordan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Then he muttered under his breath, Fine, but if this goes south, you never met me. She offered him a small, knowing smile. Deal. Jordan glanced around before standing. Meet me by the rear galley in 5 minutes. Don't let anyone see you. Naomi nodded, waiting a few beats before casually rising from her seat. She strolled toward the back of the plane, her heart hammering. This was reckless, stupid even. But if she was right, this wasn't just about drugs, and she needed to know exactly what Skynova Airlines was hiding. The rear galley was dimly lit, the faint hum of the plane's engines masking the sound of Naomi's steady breathing. She stood near the service station, pretending to glance at the laminated safety instructions posted on the wall. But her mind was locked onto what was about to happen. A soft shuffle of footsteps approached. Jordan. He didn't make eye contact, just busied himself with a stack of napkins on the counter, speaking low enough that only she could hear. The hatch is behind that cart, he murmured. I can cover you for about 2 minutes before someone comes looking. Naomi followed his gaze, spotting the metal panel near the floor. A discreet latch blended seamlessly with the surface, nearly invisible to the untrained eye. Are you sure about this? Jordan asked, his voice carrying an edge of unease. No, she admitted, but I'm doing it anyway. With a final glance to ensure no one was watching, Naomi crouched down and unlatched the panel. The moment the door slid open, a wave of cool, stale air rushed upward. A narrow metal ladder descended into the lower storage compartment. She took one last breath and climbed down. The second her feet hit the grated floor, the noise of the plane above became muffled, like she had stepped into a different world. The space was cramped, lined with stacked supply crates and duffel bags marked with Skynova's logo. It wasn't the main cargo hold. This was a secondary compartment, likely reserved for crew storage. And yet, something felt off. Naomi moved carefully between the containers, her pulse quickening. She unzipped one of the bags. Inside, neatly packed, were several small vacuum-sealed bricks. Drugs. But then she noticed something else. A metal lockbox wedged between 2 crates. She knelt, flipping it open. Her stomach turned. Passports. At least a dozen of them, all bearing different names and faces. Some looked fresh, others worn and tattered. She flipped through the pages, a sick realization settling over her. This wasn't just about drug smuggling. They were trafficking people. Naomi's hands tightened around the passports as the full weight of the situation hit her. This was beyond anything she had imagined, an organized pipeline of undocumented individuals being moved across borders under the cover of a luxury airline. A sudden thud from above made her freeze. Then a voice, "Hey!" Jordan. Naomi's heart lurched. He was stalling someone. She snapped the lockbox shut and shoved it back into place, zipping the bag closed as quickly as she could. With practiced speed, she climbed the ladder and pulled the hatch shut just as the galley door swung open. Sloane. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, one brow arched. Miss Ellsworth, she said, her voice dripping with false politeness. Stretching your legs again? Naomi steadied herself, brushing imaginary lint from her sleeve. Long flights make me restless. Sloane didn't move. You're quite the curious one, aren't you? Naomi met her gaze evenly. I like to know what's happening around me. Sloane's smirk didn't reach her eyes. That's a dangerous habit. Jordan cleared his throat, stepping between them. Ms. Ellsworth was just asking about the menu selections, he said, voice neutral. Sloane let the silence stretch before finally nodding. Of course, enjoy the rest of your flight." She turned and walked away, but Naomi knew the message was clear. They were watching her now, and if she wasn't careful, she wouldn't make it to landing. Naomi returned to her seat, forcing herself to appear calm, but her pulse hammered beneath her skin. The discovery in the storage compartment had shifted everything. She had boarded this flight thinking she was exposing corporate discrimination. Now she was staring at an operation far darker than she had ever anticipated. Human trafficking. She stared out the window, her own reflection staring back at her in the dim glass. The passports, the hidden compartment, the cold efficiency of it all. It was systemic, well-oiled, controlled, and she had just put herself in the middle of it. A drink clinked onto the tray beside her. Naomi blinked, snapping out of her thoughts. Sloane. She stood there, cool as ever, holding a glass of water. "You look like you could use a refreshment." Naomi forced a tight-lipped smile. "Thoughtful of you." Sloane leaned down slightly, her voice a whisper. "Curiosity is a dangerous thing, Ms. Ellsworth." Naomi didn't flinch. "So is underestimating the wrong person?" Sloane chuckled, straightening. "We'll see about that." She walked away, leaving Naomi gripping the armrest harder than she meant to. The message was clear. They knew. And now Naomi had to make sure she survived long enough to do something about it. She exhaled slowly, steadying her thoughts. She needed to get word out. The moment they landed, she would contact the authorities, the press, anyone who could blow this open before it was buried. A flicker of movement caught her eye. Jordan. He was walking down the aisle, pushing a service cart, but as he passed, he slipped a folded napkin onto her tray. She didn't react, waiting until he was several steps away before picking it up. 4 words scrawled in shaky handwriting. "They know. Be ready." A chill ran through her. Naomi clenched her jaw, staring straight ahead. The game had changed. Now it wasn't just about exposing the truth. It was about surviving it. The weight of the napkin in Naomi's hand felt heavier than it should have. 4 simple words. They know. Be ready. Yet they carried the full weight of a warning she could not afford to ignore. She tucked it beneath her tray and forced herself to breathe evenly. If Sloane and her people knew she had seen too much, they wouldn't wait for landing to neutralize the threat. They had an entire aircraft to work with, one where they controlled the rules. The plane remained steady, cruising through the darkness. But Naomi felt the noose tightening around her. Think. She needed to secure evidence. Her word alone wouldn't be enough. A recording, photos, the passports, the storage compartment. It was all still down there, but how could she get back without raising suspicion? Her gaze flickered toward the front of the cabin. The man in 3A, the one who had received something from Sloane earlier, was still seated, legs crossed, fingers tapping lightly on the armrest. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't restless. He was waiting. For what? Naomi's stomach coiled at the thought. She turned toward the aisle, watching as Jordan made his way through the cabin again. He didn't stop at her row, didn't even glance in her direction. But as he passed, he let something small fall into her lap. A key. Her heart skipped. She kept her expression neutral, slipping it into her pocket without hesitation. Jordan had just given her access. She knew what she had to do. She rose slowly, stretching as if she were merely adjusting after a long flight, then made her way toward the back of the plane. The lighting in the rear galley was dimmer now, the rest of the passengers settling into the lull of the journey. No one stopped her. She crouched near the panel, heart hammering as she slid the key into the lock. A soft click. The hatch unlatched. She exhaled sharply, glancing over her shoulder before descending the ladder once more. Cool, stale air rushed over her as she stepped onto the grated floor. The storage compartment was just as she had left it. Rows of cargo, duffel bags marked with Skynova's logo, and the locked metal box. She moved quickly, pulling her phone from her pocket, snapping photos as fast as she could. The passports, the vacuum-sealed bricks of contraband, everything. A soft creak above her made her freeze. Footsteps. Naomi's breath hitched. Someone else was up there. She shoved her phone into her pocket, shutting the lockbox as quietly as she could before turning toward the ladder. Another creak. Closer. She climbed fast, her pulse pounding in her ears. The moment she emerged into the galley, she turned and found herself face to face with Sloane. The flight attendant leaned against the counter, arms folded, one perfectly arched brow lifted. Going somewhere? Naomi's fingers curled into fists. She had been caught, and now there was nowhere left to run. Naomi's heart pounded against her ribs, but she didn't let it show. Sloane stood between her and the aisle, blocking any easy escape. The hum of the plane's engines filled the silence between them, stretching the tension taut like a wire about to snap. "Looking for something, Ms. Ellsworth?" Sloane's voice was light, almost amused, but her eyes carried something much colder. Naomi straightened, smoothing out her blazer like she had just finished an innocent task. "Just stretching my legs," she said casually. Sloane tilted her head, lips curling into a slow, knowing smirk. "Funny. That's the second time you found yourself in places you don't belong." Naomi didn't blink. "I wasn't aware first-class passengers had restrictions on movement." Sloane stepped closer, just a fraction, but enough to make it clear she was in control. "Oh, we don't." A pause, then quieter. "But we do have rules." The way she said it sent a chill through Naomi's spine. Behind Sloane, the rear galley door leading to the crew's quarters was slightly ajar. If Sloane had backup, Naomi wouldn't have time to react. Think. She needed to shift the power dynamic. Naomi exhaled, crossing her arms as if she wasn't the one trapped. "You know, I always find it interesting when people in power get sloppy," she mused. Sloane's smile didn't waver, but her fingers twitched slightly against her sleeve. "You act like you run this plane," Naomi continued, lowering her voice just enough to make it personal. "But I don't think you do. You're a cog in a machine. Someone else is pulling the strings." Sloane's smirk tightened, her mask of amusement cracking just enough for Naomi to see the irritation beneath. A direct hit. Sloane leaned in slightly, voice barely above a whisper. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Naomi held her ground. "Then enlighten me." For the first time, something flickered in Sloane's expression. Hesitation, uncertainty. Then just as quickly, it was gone. "Enjoy the rest of your flight, Miss Ellsworth," she said smoothly, stepping aside. Naomi didn't wait for another warning. She walked past her, forcing herself to keep her pace measured, her breathing steady. She made it back to her seat, sinking into the cushion like nothing had happened. But inside, her mind was racing. Sloane wasn't acting alone. She was following orders, which meant there was someone else, someone bigger, waiting at the other end of this flight, and Naomi was about to meet them. The plane began its slow descent, the soft chime overhead signaling the cabin crew to prepare for landing. Naomi's grip on the armrest tightened. The past few hours had been a relentless game of cat and mouse, and now she was running out of time. She had evidence. Photos of the passports, the smuggled contraband, and the secret compartment in the storage bay. But she also knew that if Sloane and her people realized she had them, she might not make it off this plane. Sloane had let her go. For now. That meant one thing. They weren't planning to handle this in the air. They were waiting until she was on the ground. The seatbelt sign dinged, and passengers around her began shifting in their seats, stretching, preparing for the landing. Naomi forced herself to appear casual, watching the cabin crew move with rehearsed efficiency. Jordan passed by, avoiding her gaze, but his shoulders were tense. He knew what was coming. Naomi needed a plan. She reached for her phone, her fingers moving quickly under the tray table, pulling up her notes app. If she couldn't get a message out, she could at least leave something behind. Flight 417, Sky Nova Airlines. Human trafficking operation. If anything happens to me, check the cargo hold. She hesitated for half a second before typing one more word. Sloane. She locked the phone and slid it under her seat, wedging it just enough so it wouldn't be easily spotted. If she didn't make it out, someone would find it. The plane touched down with a jolt, the runway lights streaking past the window. Naomi's pulse pounded in her ears. The real danger was about to begin. As the plane taxied to the gate, she caught sight of Sloane near the front, speaking quietly with the man in 3A. He nodded once before standing, adjusting his suit jacket. Naomi swallowed hard. She had seen that kind of efficiency before. It was the kind that meant something had already been decided. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself. No matter what happened next, she wasn't going down without a fight. The plane rolled to a stop at the gate, and a familiar chime signaled the release of seatbelts. Around Naomi, passengers shifted, stretching stiff limbs and reaching for their belongings, all blissfully unaware of the silent war brewing just beneath the surface. She sat motionless, watching, calculating. Sloane stood near the exit, her hands folded neatly in front of her, the picture of professionalism. But Naomi knew better now. Every move she made was deliberate, every glance calculated. The man in 3A wasn't in a rush to leave either. He remained seated, waiting, his posture relaxed but purposeful. He wasn't just another businessman trying to make a quick escape from the aircraft. Number He was waiting for her. Naomi clenched her jaw, scanning the faces of the other passengers. She needed an exit strategy, something to give her an edge before they got her alone. A movement near the back of the cabin caught her attention. Jordan. His posture was stiff, his fingers tapping restlessly against his tray. She knew fear when she saw it. The flight attendants began their usual exit routine, guiding passengers off row by row. First class would be the last to leave, giving Sloane all the time she needed to maneuver Naomi where she wanted her. Naomi reached into her bag, fingers grazing the napkin Jordan had given her earlier. They know. Be ready. She slipped it into her pocket and stood. She needed to get off this plane. Now she stepped into the aisle, moving toward the exit. But as she passed the galley, Sloane's voice stopped her cold. Ms. Ellsworth. Naomi turned slowly. Sloane's smile was perfectly poised. A moment of your time before you disembark? Naomi's skin prickled. I'm in a bit of a hurry. Sloane's smile didn't waver. I insist. Behind her, the man in 3A rose to his feet. Naomi felt the walls closing in. She turned, her pulse quickening, but before she could move, a voice cut through the tension. Miss Ellsworth? Naomi's head snapped up. At the front of the jet bridge, just beyond the exit, stood two uniformed officers. The moment Sloane saw them, her smile faltered. Is there a problem? Naomi asked, keeping her voice steady. One of the officers stepped forward, his expression unreadable. We'd like you to come with us. Naomi's heart pounded. For a split second, she thought Sloane had beaten her to the punch, that she was already being taken into custody before she could expose the truth. Then she caught the way Sloane's fingers twitched at her side. She wasn't in control of this. Naomi exhaled slowly, adjusting the strap of her bag. Well, she said, stepping forward, meeting Sloane's gaze head-on. I wouldn't want to keep law enforcement waiting. She walked past Sloane without another word, feeling the weight of the flight attendant's glare searing into her back. Naomi didn't know if the officers were here to help her or to silence her, but either way, she had just bought herself time. Naomi stepped off the plane, the cool, artificial air of the airport terminal a sharp contrast to the tension still clinging to her skin. The two uniformed officers flanked her, their expressions unreadable as they led her down the quiet jet bridge, away from the disembarking passengers. She kept her posture straight, her heart hammering in her chest. Was she being protected, or was this just another layer of the trap? As they reached a secluded security checkpoint, one of the officers turned to face her. His badge read, Detective Ryan Whitaker. Whitaker. The name sent a ripple of unease through her. Her gaze flicked toward the second officer, who stood silently by the door. A sentry. Ms. Ellsworth, Detective Whitaker said, his tone measured. We need to have a conversation. Naomi crossed her arms, keeping her expression neutral. Funny, that's exactly what I was thinking. The detective's mouth twitched slightly, but there was no humor in his eyes. You've made some powerful enemies tonight. She exhaled slowly. Then I must be doing something right. Whitaker's gaze sharpened. You have no idea how deep this goes. I know enough. The detective studied her, his fingers tapping lightly against the file he carried. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a photo, flipping it onto the table between them. Naomi's breath caught. The man in the picture was the passenger from 3A. He's not just some businessman, Whitaker said. His name is Vincent DeLuca, works for an international trafficking syndicate. Human smuggling, narcotics, arms dealing. He's been on our radar for years, but we've never had enough to pin him. Naomi clenched her jaw. In Skynova Airlines? Whitaker nodded. A front, certain flights, certain routes. They're used to move people and contraband undetected. It's been operating for years, and until tonight, we didn't have the leverage we needed to blow it open. She exhaled sharply, trying to steady the adrenaline rushing through her. Sloan. Whitaker's jaw tightened. She's not the mastermind, but she's a key player. And her father, Thomas Whitaker, Naomi's stomach twisted. Wait, Whitaker? As in, yes. The detective's expression darkened. My uncle. The room fell into silence. A Whitaker working to take down the Whitakers. Naomi let out a slow breath. So what happens now? Whitaker closed the file. You're not safe. They won't just let this go. We need to move fast. Naomi's pulse quickened. This wasn't just about exposing corruption anymore. This was about survival, and the fight had only just begun. Naomi had faced intimidation before, threats, power plays, but this was different. This wasn't just about justice anymore. This was war. She sat across from Detective Ryan Whitaker, the weight of his words settling over her like a suffocating fog. You're not safe. The Whitaker name carried power, influence, and a legacy built on corruption. Sloan was merely a lieutenant in her father's empire, a pawn enforcing his will. And now Naomi had set herself up as an enemy of one of the most well-connected criminal families in the country. She leaned forward, her voice steady. So tell me, Detective, what's the plan? Whitaker studied her carefully. We need to move fast. The moment DeLuca and Sloan realize you're in custody, they'll try to control the narrative. We have a small window before they spin this into something else. Naomi exhaled, her mind working fast. And what do you need from me? The detective pulled out his phone and placed it on the table between them. The screen showed a familiar image, the photos she had taken, the ones she thought were still trapped on her offline device. How? Jordan Mendez, Whitaker interrupted. Your flight attendant friend. He sent them to us through an encrypted server before you even landed. He knew you'd need backup. Naomi's chest tightened. Jordan had risked everything. What happens to him? She asked quietly. Whitaker's expression darkened. We're working on getting him into protection, but people like Sloan don't forget traitors. A beat of silence passed before Naomi spoke again. And Sloan? Whitaker exhaled through his nose. We'll arrest her the moment she steps off the plane. Naomi nodded, but she knew that wouldn't be the end of it. Thomas Whitaker wasn't going to let his daughter go down without a fight. She glanced at the clock on the wall. Every second that passed, the noose around Sloan and the operation was tightening. But Naomi also knew something else. Cornered animals always fought the hardest, and Sloan Whitaker wasn't the type to go quietly. A few floors below, the arrival terminal bustled with the usual chaos of JFK International Airport. Passengers collected their luggage, families embraced, taxis lined up outside. But near gate C-23, a different scene was unfolding. Sloan stepped off the plane, her movements smooth, effortless, as if she hadn't spent the last few hours playing a high-stakes game of manipulation. Then she saw them, two plainclothes officers waiting just past the jet bridge, their stance unmistakable. Her lips pressed together, but otherwise she didn't react. She adjusted the strap of her leather carry-on, smoothed out the front of her uniform. Then as she walked past the first officer, she ran, a burst of movement, a sharp shove against a bystander, a desperate sprint toward the nearest exit. Stop her! Someone shouted. Sloan ducked between crowds, her polished heels clicking against the tile as she made a break for the terminal doors. But she had barely made it 20 yards before an airport security officer stepped into her path. A swift movement, a sharp yelp, and then she was on the ground, her arms twisted behind her back, her face pressed against the cold tile. She struggled, but the fight was already over. The cuffs clicked shut around her wrists. For the first time in her life, Sloan Whitaker was no longer in control, and Naomi Ellsworth had won. But even as she sat in that security office, watching the clock tick forward, she knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of something much bigger. Naomi sat in the sterile conference room of JFK's security office, her fingers interlocked tightly on the table. Through the reinforced glass window, she could see the terminal bustling with travelers, unaware of the takedown that had just unfolded. Sloan Whitaker had been dragged off in handcuffs. Vincent DeLuca had disappeared, likely tipped off the moment the arrest happened. And yet Naomi didn't feel victorious. Not yet. Detective Whitaker re-entered the room, his expression unreadable. He tossed a folder onto the table and exhaled sharply. Sloane's in holding, but she isn't talking. She's a Whitaker through and through. She knows how to play this game. Naomi leaned back in her chair. Then we force her hand. Whitaker arched a brow. Oh? And how do you propose we do that? Naomi tapped her fingers against the table. She's valuable to her father, right? Thomas Whitaker won't let her rot in a cell. He'll move pieces, leverage his contacts, do whatever he can to erase this from public record. Whitaker nodded slowly. That's exactly what we're worried about. Naomi met his gaze. Then we take the choice away from him. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, unlocking it with swift precision. The photos, the documents, the evidence she and Jordan had risked everything to uncover. She turned the screen toward Whitaker. We go public, right now, before Thomas can scrub this clean. Whitaker exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Jesus. But he didn't argue. Instead, he reached for his own phone and made the call. Within an hour, the first news alert hit the airwaves. Breaking. Sky Nova Airlines. Tied to human trafficking ring. CEO under investigation. The headline spread like wildfire. News stations picked it up. Journalists swarmed the airport. And just like that, Thomas Whitaker had lost control of the narrative. Naomi stepped outside into the cold night air, drawing in a deep breath. Jordan Mendez stood a few feet away, his arms crossed, eyes darting between his security officers like he expected someone to drag him back inside at any moment. She approached slowly. They're putting you into protection? Jordan gave a short nod. Yeah, I gave them everything I knew. His jaw tightened. But Sloane isn't the only one we need to worry about. Naomi knew he was right. This wasn't over. Thomas Whitaker was still out there. Vincent DeLuca had slipped away. The operation had taken a hit, but the machine wasn't fully broken yet. She turned her gaze toward the city skyline. The weight of everything settled into her bones. Then she exhaled. This fight wasn't over, not yet. But for the first time, she wasn't the only one in it. Naomi Ellsworth stepped away from the airport, her breath visible in the cold night air. The city pulsed around her, alive with movement, unaware of the battle that had just taken place above its skyline. This wasn't just about one flight, one corrupt airline, or one woman's arrogance. It was about something far bigger, how power is wielded, how systems protect those who exploit the vulnerable, and how the truth is often buried beneath layers of control. But tonight, the truth had won, at least for now. Justice isn't always swift, and it's rarely clean. But it starts with those willing to ask questions, to push back against the forces that say, stay in your lane. Naomi had refused to do that, and because of it, a corrupt empire had begun to crumble. But the question remains, how many more are still out there, operating in plain sight? What would you have done in her place? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories of truth, power, and the people who dare to fight back, don't forget to subscribe. There's always another story waiting to be told.